Primary key is one of the most important constraints added when creating a table. Primary key is a field or combination of fields that uniquely identifies a record. To understand the importance of a primary key, let's take a look at this table. Here we have a table, a student table that contains information about some of our students. So we have the first name, the last name, we have the date of birth, as well as the test results. If we choose to identify each of our students for whatever reason, how do we uniquely identify each of the students? Well, we have 4 columns. Let's see. We have the first name. In the first name column, it's not possible to uniquely identify the student because we do have Julia, which is showing up twice. And if we look at the last name, we also have Fisher. So we have Julia Fisher. And we can see that by the date of birth that these are 2 different people. The first Julia Fisher was born January 9th, 1995. And the second Julia Fisher was born June 1st, 1990. So the first name column, the last name column, clearly we cannot use any of those to uniquely identify our students. We certainly cannot use the date of birth as well because we have Julia Fisher, who was born January 9th, 1995, and we have Max Anthony, who was born January 9th, 1995 as well. So again, we can rule out the third column, the date of birth. When we look at the test results, we also have the test result of 95 showing up twice. So we have Julia Fisher with a test result of 95, and we have Abby Francisco with a test result of 95 as well. So just imagine you're running a college, and again, you need to uniquely identify each of the students for many reasons, either to post their test result, for identification purposes. How do we ensure that we can uniquely identify our students? In the previous video, we talked about using the unique constraint to add constraints to our columns. However, we cannot add a unique constraint to all of our columns because it just wouldn't make sense. Because for instance, with the date of birth, there will be students that they do have the same date of birth, so we can't enforce a unique constraint on that column. The same thing applies to test, the same thing applies to last name, the same thing applies to the first name. So while the unique constraint could be used, it doesn't work in all situations. Let's just put it that way. In order to solve this problem, we can create a unique column that identifies each record uniquely. So we have a student ID, and each of the fields is unique to each of the students. So student ID 1001 belongs to Julia Fisher. Student ID 1002, Gabriel Thompson. Student ID 1003, Julia Fisher. Student ID 1004, Max Anthony. And ID 1005 belongs to Abby Francisco. So this way, because the student ID is unique to each of our students, we now have a unique identifier to distinguish each of our students. And this is what primary key is. A primary key is unique for each record in our table, and it helps us to uniquely identify each record within the table. Another way to illustrate how primary keys work is looking at the other table. Here we have Julia Fisher, who has bought 2 jackets at 2 different prices, one at $200 and another at $350. We also have Masha and Tony, who has bought a jacket for $400. For our record purposes, how do we distinguish between all of those jackets? How do we know which jacket belongs to who? Well, the solution again would be to create an order ID that such that each order is unique to each of the customers. And this is important both from a business point of view, but also from a customer side. Just imagine the times you've had to purchase an item, say from Amazon. Now you get an email with a confirmation of that transaction, and that typically comes with an order ID or an item ID. A lot of times you might need to track the shipment of that order. Well, most times you need the order ID to be able to track that transaction either through online or either maybe calling in. They will always ask you what was the transaction ID. And sometimes they may ask you for a combination of information, and it could be the order ID and your email. Especially if you're trying to track it online, it could ask for your order ID and your last name, for instance. In this scenario, there's a good chance that the website is actually using both the order ID as well as your last name as the primary key, because that now uniquely identifies you with that transaction. So this is the purpose of having a primary key within our table. It helps us to identify each record, each record within the table. Most times the column used as the primary key is generated internally. Yes, we can use the email address, but someone could potentially type in a wrong email address into our website, for instance, or there could be a typo with the email, or something wrong with that email. We certainly cannot use the price or shouldn't use the price, because that changes all the time depending on maybe promotion or some marketing that we're doing within our company. The first and last name, the last name can change for any reason. Someone can choose to change their name. Someone could get married and again change their name. So at best, we want to use a generated column that is accurate, that we know is accurate because we created that. And what we can do again is to use a combination of fields. So we use the order ID as well as the email. So the combination of both then uniquely identifies our record. Let's take a look at the syntax for adding a primary key to a column within our table. So the syntax is, we're familiar with the create table. So just like when we create our table, we have the create table, the name of the table, and then we have the column, the data type, and just next to that, we just write primary key to indicate that that column is a primary key column. Let's switch over to our SQL Server and try this out. So I'll start by adding a comment. Just say add primary key to a column. Okay. So we're going to create a new table. I will call this table, let's call it student enrollment. And would like to have the student ID. And this would be an integer because it will be a number. And this is what we want to use as our primary key. And all we need to do is just type primary key. Now, one of the conditions of a primary key is that the field that the primary key is added to cannot be null, which means there has to be a value, a not null value within that field. Now, in the past, we could do, we'll do something like just adding a not null to indicate that there has to be a value has to be entered into this field. But the primary key constraint itself actually mandates that that field cannot be null. So we really don't have to include a not null. All we need to do is the name of the column, we have the data type, and then we just write primary key. So the next thing we want is the first name, like the student name. Yeah, we could do student name, and this would be varchar, and we'll make that varchar 50. And yeah, we could have a not null because we would want to have our student's first name, and then we have the last name, and that'll be varchar 50 as well, and that'll be not null. And we can have the student's email, and that'll be varchar. And we could make that optional. Then we close that, and let's create our table. So let's take a look at the schema of our table. Student enrollment. Okay, so we have the student ID, the first name, the last name, and the email. So we'll insert some records into our table. Insert into student enrollment. And let's see if our constraint on the student ID is functional. So we'll just not add the student ID as one of the columns we want to insert information into, and let's see what happens. So we'd say first name, say last name, and let's say email. And the values would be, let's say first name is maybe Sean Maxwell. It's the last name, and would have the email as Sean101 at yahoo.com. And let's try and insert this record. So now we get an error message that says, oh, what happened there? Okay, let's do that again. Cannot insert value, so cannot insert a null value into the column student ID. And this is, again, because we've made it a primary key. So it's saying that this cannot be a null value column. We have to insert information into it. So let's then just going to add the student ID. Student ID. And now we can say our student ID is 1003. Okay. And now when we execute this, then select our record. Now we have the record has been inserted into our table. Let's insert 2 or 3 more records into our table. So we have the student ID, first name, last name, and email. Would say this ID is 1005, and we'll call this Mary Fisher, and we'll change the email to Mary_Fish1. Okay, and we'll just insert another record, and we'll say 1007, and this will be Matthias Crompton, and the email would be matthiascromp@gmail.com. Okay. All right, let's see what's wrong here. Yeah, it's Crompton. Okay. See that? Put in the strings in quotes. Now we can insert this record. Okay, so let's take a look at our student enrollment table. So we have 3 records. There is another way we can pass the primary key constraint on our table, and I'll show you how to do that now. We'd have to create another table. So we create a table and we'll just call this student enrollment 2. And I will copy the schema we have above here because it's really the same thing. Just want to show you the other way we can pass the primary key constraint. So all we need to do is just delete the constraint we added right here. Oh, sorry, that's to be int. We have our comma, and now we just have right here. We'll just type in primary key, and which field is the primary key, or which field do we want to make the primary key? We want the student ID field to be the primary key. So in brackets, we just type student ID. Then we close that. And now when we run this, this will create a new table. And let's see, select all from student enrollment 2. Let's see what it looks like. So we have a table. So let's insert some records, and I'll just copy this record and just paste. Changes to student enrollment 2 because now that's where we want to paste that. Let's bring this down. And I mean, we could have the same record, but maybe let's add a couple more records. So I'll copy those 2 records. Now just enter. We can change the details. 154. And we call this, what's the name? Steven Madi. We have Steve Madi at live.com. And let's see, we can have this as student ID 177. And let's say Poonam. And oh, gotta help me. Poonam David. Okay. Let's say davepoonam@gmail.com. Yeah, so that's fine. And now we can insert this record. When we select, we have our records. And if we wanted to confirm that our primary key constraint is working, which it is, we can try and insert a record without adding the student ID, and that's going to give us an error message because again we have to insert a record into that field. And let's just try it. Let's do this. Just going to copy that and then paste. And what we want to do now is to exclude the student ID field and exclude this. And again, this is going to give us an error message. So execute, and it says cannot insert the value null into column student ID, which is our primary key. And on the table, student enrollment 2, column does not allow nulls. So that has been implemented, and that's really, again, just talking about primary key, the importance of primary key. It ensures that within our table that each record is unique, and that's very important depending again on how the schema of our table looks like. We can also take a look at the schema of our table through Object Explorer. So if we go to under databases, we select our company database if that's still what you're using, and if that's where you saved the That's where you save the tables we created, the student enrollment table. So under tables, we click on the drop-down menu, and there I have the student enrollment and student enrollment 2. If you click on that, and then if we go to the columns, here we have the schema for our table. So we have the student ID column, and the P key here indicates that this is the primary key, and it shows that it's an integer, and it's not null. We have the first name, last name, email, as well as the schema. And under the keys as well, it does show that the student ID, that we do have a primary key in this table, and it is represented by the student ID. If we check our student enrollment 2, we should see the same thing. On the columns, we have the student ID as the primary key, and we have the first name, last name, and email, and all of its key, the data types and how we defined it. And if we again click on keys, we see that we have a primary key, which is the student ID.